Hello, I'm Senator Ben Cardin. Welcome to Facebook Live, a program that I conduct every once in a while, bringing in distinguished people to go over a subject that is currently being debated in Congress. And I'm very pleased today to have one of my colleagues from the state legislature, Delegate Vanessa Atterbeary from Howard County, District 24, Vice Chair of the Judiciary Committee in the House of Delegates, and was appointed by Speaker Jones to head up the working group on police reform and accountability. Vanessa, it's wonderful to have you with us. And I start by congratulating you on a very successful General Assembly session. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But let me set the stage. We know that we have systemic challenges in America. We have systemic racism. It became very clear to the American people as they saw the videos of the impact of discrimination in policing. Obviously, the George Floyd murder was the number one exhibit. But in Baltimore, we saw the Freddie Gray Jr. tragedy, and every community in our country has experienced the challenges that minority communities have in policing. So we have these systemic challenges that we have to deal with, and we've been working for a long time to try to deal with this. I've introduced legislation for the last several Congresses to end religious and racial profiling, and we'll talk a little bit about that. In the Law Enforcement Integrity and Trust Act to deal with accountability for police misconduct and have proper training, et cetera. And we have been making some incremental progress, but not very much. I think it took a tragedy such as George Floyd to bring to the center of America's interests that we have to make a fundamental change in policing, that we really need to change the attitude of policing from a warrior mentality to a guardian mentality. So I know we're going to be joined shortly by Derrick Johnson, the president and CEO of the NAACP. But if I could start with you, I think Derrick has joined us. Welcome, Derrick. It's good to have you with us also on Facebook Live. We have just got started, but I wanted to give Vanessa an opportunity to go over what happened in the Maryland General Assembly, her work in the working group, and what she was able to get done in the Maryland General Assembly over the objections of our governor.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Cardin. It is such a pleasure to be here with you and Derrick Johnson. I am Delegate Vanessa Atterbeary. I am in my second term in the Maryland General Assembly. And like the Senator said, I'm Vice Chair of the Judiciary Committee, and I represent District 13 in Howard County, which I am proud to do. I was born and raised in Howard County, so I'm a very proud Howard Countian and raising my children here as well. So in the General Assembly, we passed sweeping police reform. It's so sweeping and groundbreaking. It was mentioned after we passed it on The View. Whoopi Goldberg said that everyone should follow in Maryland's footsteps. So I'll just go over kind of the big buckets because it's so sweeping. There are a lot of little nuggets and little nuances, but I'll go over kind of the big sweeping changes that we did. And I'll start off by saying that Speaker Adrienne Jones, the first African-American and female Speaker of the House in Annapolis, and my chair of Judiciary, Luke Clippinger, created the work group in May, 5 days after the murder of George Floyd. And kind of 11 months later, the General Assembly passed this sweeping legislation, and then we get the guilty verdict. So it's kind of the bookends. It's kind of so people can appreciate the time frame. But the first thing that we did was repeal the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. We were the first in the country to repeal it, and we were the first in the country to actually establish it. So that's pretty groundbreaking right there. In its place, we put in accountability measures for disciplinary actions of police officers, and we've incorporated citizens into every step of the process so that there's transparency and that the citizens know actually what's going on. We require implicit bias testing and training at the onset of hiring and during the career of the officer. We've implemented an early warning system so that we can identify officers that do violate use of force statutes and that there can be intervention if there has to be. Otherwise, those officers can, quite frankly, be decertified. We created a use of force statute, which has your things in it like de-escalation requirements, a duty to intervene, and specifically there are criminal penalties for officers who knowingly violate the use of force statute. And we changed the use of force here in Maryland that it has to be necessary and proportional to the force that the officer is quite frankly facing himself. We created sweeping reform when it comes to transparency of police disciplinary records. Folks would file a complaint against an officer and not know what happened to that complaint. So now all of the complaints can be released to the public. We changed no-knock warrants. This is the Breonna Taylor situation that the nation is talking about. We tightened up the standard. We tightened up the time. So you can only now get no-knock warrants if an officer is feeling that someone's life is threatened. They can only be implemented between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. And there are several layers before the request actually gets to a judge that have to be taken. And finally, we said that when there is an independent, that when there is a shooting or a death as the result of the actions of a police officer, that there will be an independent investigation by the Attorney General's office. So, Frank, you don't have the police policing themselves. I just want to mention a couple smaller items that we did that don't quite get the national attention as some of these other big items, but they're quite groundbreaking. We created loans and scholarships here so that if you attend a Maryland institution, you can, if you're already an officer and you commit to a department for 5 years, then you can get your tuition repaid. We created scholarships so that if you intend to go into law enforcement and you commit, you can get that your tuition repaid as well. Body cameras. There should be body cameras by 2023 for certain jurisdictions and 2025 for other jurisdictions. We increased the civil liability caps for when individuals seek redress through the localities, which was important. And finally, I want to mention, and this is really important, we put into law that when an officer stops you, they have to tell you why they stopped you. There can't be this kind of rhetorical back and forth. Do you know why I stopped you? Well, no, I don't, officer. And an officer cannot say that you cannot tape the interaction. They cannot take away your recording device. So these are some of the major changes that we did here in Maryland that I'm really proud of.
Well, once again, congratulations. And of course, you enacted this bill over the objections of the governor. So it showed that you had not only the skills in getting legislation drafted, but you also have the skills in getting the votes necessary to get it passed. So great work. Derrick Johnson, good to have you with us, the president and CEO of the NAACP. Your record is so legendary as to what you've been able to accomplish. We're on Facebook Live, which I say because I know that you took on Facebook in regards to the Russian interference into the African-American community. So great work in that regard. We very much appreciate your efforts against the Trump information in regards to the DACA registrants, and the list goes on and on and on, what you've been able to achieve, what the NAACP has been able to achieve under your leadership. Justice and policing, a bill that's been introduced at the present time. Senator Booker of New Jersey is heading up our efforts in negotiation with Republicans. Senator Schumer is committed for this bill to be on the floor of the United States Senate. Just how important is it for the federal government to act? You've heard from Delegate Atterbeary that the state has acted. How important is it for the federal government to pass laws?
First of all, Senator Cardin, thank you for putting this discussion together. It's also important. And also to Delegate Atterbeary, what you just described is amazing. And thank you for your effort. Far too many people talk about the problem. Far few people really pursue outcomes to address with clear solutions. And what I just heard is part of that. But we also must create a federal floor to keep people safe while also allowing our communities to feel comfortable with law enforcement agencies across the country. A federal floor that we all can have the same level of expectation when we encounter law enforcement officers. And there should be an expectation that they are there to truly carry out a duty of protecting and serving, not profiling individuals because of their characteristics, particularly African Americans. And so as we await the outcome of the negotiations, that federal floor should include police being held accountable for their activities, and their shield, their badge, should not be something that will block accountability. So whether it's qualified immunity, making sure that there is a public-facing federal registry of police misconduct, so officers cannot go from jurisdiction to jurisdictions, although they have been found guilty of police misconduct, whether that finding is an administrative hearing inside of an agency or a court proceeding. Tamir Rice will be with us today, but for not having such a database, so the law enforcement officer who pulled the trigger was dismissed from an agency, but was allowed to go to another agency and still operate as a law officer, although that person's record was something that didn't go over. We must also address the question of 242, that the standard of review is too high. Reckless conduct in the legal setting is a very high bar. It allows for too much to take place before a police officer is held accountable criminally for activities. Can you imagine? It took the public view, a video camera, broad daylight, global outcry for Derrick Chauvin to be found guilty. If that young lady did not record it, if in fact we were not in a pandemic where people were paying more attention to social media platforms, he would have gotten away with another crime. And what's most appalling is that had he not been found guilty under Minnesota's arbitration rules, he could have been reinstated despite being fired. Met with the police chief in Minneapolis and the mayor. One of the most frustrating things that they have had to acknowledge is 50% of law enforcement officers who are terminated are reinstated because of arbitration rules. That shouldn't be the case. But then more importantly, jurisdictions should have the same level of expectation in policing, so you don't have scenarios like we've seen in Ferguson, where that law enforcement agency was using predatory policing to cover the city's raise funds for the city, pretty much. So there should be the same level of expectations, whether you go from a rural community to an urban community, whether it's state police or county sheriffs. We should have the same level of expectations. So we look forward to the outcome of the negotiations, as I do know you, Senator Cardin, Senator Booker, Congresswoman Bass, will make sure we have the necessary tools in the bill so that we can have a different relationship with law enforcement agencies and officers across the country.
I really appreciate the way that you describe this. We need a federal floor, not necessarily a federal ceiling. We still have a system of federalism where our states can give us best practices. And Maryland, of course, has been one of those states that has been pretty aggressive in their General Assembly. Although when you look at the history of Maryland, we have real challenges in policing. One of the first consent orders that we had dealt with the problems of profiling within the Maryland State Police, where we had discriminatory profiling against African Americans on a traffic stops that led to a consent decree to end that practice. But we still have problems throughout the country on racial profiling. I will always remember and appreciate the work of a member of my staff, Reverend Jerome Stevens. After the Freddie Gray episode in Baltimore, he arranged certain meetings for me to meet with representatives from the community. I remember meeting with representatives of Sandtown, many of whom I knew very well. These are real leaders. And they explained to me they really could not work with the police because they felt it would be wrong to turn over people from their community to the police department because they would not be treated fairly. And they just felt it was not system that would treat their community fairly. That's a pretty tragic situation for us to have had in Baltimore. And then I had another meeting with African American families that some of whom I knew. And to a family, they talked about the talk and what they had to do, particularly with their adult male children. And I should say adolescent children, as to what they had to tell them when they went out at night. And it really sensitized me to a bill that I introduced before the Freddie Gray episode, the End Religious and Racial Profiling Act, that would make it illegal at any level of law enforcement, whether it's federal, state, local, or auxiliary, to use discriminatory profiling as a way in which to target communities for discriminatory action. Obviously, if you have individual identifiers of a crime, you use that. But to target communities only turns communities against police and only wastes resources, and as we've seen, can be deadly. So I am pleased that the Justice and Policing Act includes the End Racial and Religious Profiling Act. It also includes the Law Enforcement Integrity and Trust Act that I had introduced, that deals with best practices, that deals with identifying those police officers who have violated their trust, making sure they're held accountable. And the area that you mentioned, particularly as it relates to getting data and information, so that from the inception, you know a candidate's propensities when you're in the hiring stage, rather than having to find out the hard way of a person's tendencies if the person has previously been in trouble. So I know that my friend Senator Booker is negotiating with Republicans. I hope he can bring out a comprehensive bill. I know that there is a certain amount that we need to get done at the national level, and he's committed to making sure we get those activities. I want to, I guess, talk about what we really need to do about changing the attitude in policing from the warrior mentality to the guardian. We have a consent decree in Baltimore. As a result of Freddie Gray, we all asked for a pattern and practice investigation. And as a result of that, we entered into a consent decree, which is currently being implemented in Baltimore City. But that's one of the principal objectives, is to change the Baltimore City Police Department from a warrior mentality to a guardian mentality. How do we go about making that a reality? And let me start, if I could, first. Let me start with you, Mr. Johnson, and I'll go to Delegate Atterbeary from the point of view of our local community.
Great question. Look, we have to change the culture within law enforcement agencies. One of the ways you do that is heighten these federal standards the agencies must comply with if they are to receive federal resources. It's the carrot and stick. I can recall in the mid-'80s when the state of Louisiana refused to increase their drinking age from 17 in that state to 21. And the approach that was taken by Congress was to, acknowledge that the state had the ability to make those decisions. However, those decisions, when made, could also have a consequence in terms of federal highway funds. And there was this stalemate. The state of Louisiana realized that the public interest will be better served by increasing the drinking age to 21 and have a federal highway system and infrastructure that was stable and safe than it would having a drinking age at 17 with poor roads. We need to begin to think in that manner. In many cases, many states and jurisdictions, they have home rule or the ability to make certain decisions, but those decisions should be tempered with the reality of whether or not federal resources should support those decisions. So to change culture, we need to address the standard by which we hold agencies accountable. The removing qualified immunity from the agency becomes even key because it could cost them in terms of liability if they don't change the culture. And we allow for best practices to be shared across agencies through a federal vetting process so that that floor I mentioned earlier could be applied to all agencies, therefore setting a new culture. Then finally, we have to address low pay. Far too many police officers are underpaid. Not only breed an atmosphere where we're not able to recruit the most talented and best members of society to go into law enforcement. And so we need to visit that so that we can have individuals with integrity, more individuals with integrity, character, and principle who want to go into the profession because they can provide a quality and decent life for their families.
Delegate Atterbeary.
I agree with everything that was said, and we have attempted to do that through legislation here at the state level. To just kind of piggyback on some of the comments that Mr. Johnson said and that you said, Senator. So we created in this legislation so that folks have the same expectation no matter where you are, whether you're on the shore or you're in the city or you're in Western Maryland or Central Maryland where I am. We have there will be a uniform disciplinary matrix created that all of the departments have to abide by. There will be a database that will track officers' behavior so that they can't kind of in this cloak and dagger move from department to department. And an officer, quite in this legislation, when they are applying to a specific department, they have to bring their file to you. There was the unfortunate incident of Anton Black, who died at the hands of officers in Caroline County when 3 officers held him down. He came from Delaware. He should have never been hired based on his record in Delaware. And so now we're saying you have to present us your entire file. Something else that we did, the unions cannot negotiate for disciplinary outcomes. So once these contracts currently run out, the jurisdictions that have a strong union contracts, they can negotiate for pay and health benefits and all the things that other folks, county or city employees and state employees can negotiate for, but they cannot negotiate for disciplinary outcomes. For us, the professionalizing, I think what Mr. Johnson was talking about in terms of increasing the pay and really making this a profession is why we instituted in the legislation, the scholarship and the loan programs to say, go get your education and major in something that can help you in your abilities and your trainings as a police officer. And significantly, we created a mechanism for accountability where departments that don't comply with the new statute requirements, funds can be withheld from the state for your department. So there's an incentive to comply. I mean, I think what we really want to get at here is we want trust in the police, and we want the community to trust the police, and we have to get back. We have to get back to that. And this legislation isn't a one-time fix, and everything's going to be great tomorrow. But it is certainly a first step when it comes to training and all the other things that we've implemented, where hopefully, you know, the bad actors, because we have wonderful officers. My grandmother is a 91-year-old retired sheriff out of Michigan. And so, you know, we have to uplift our wonderful officers and get the ones who don't want to comply with the laws, who don't want to use the proper use of force, get them out of there and don't hire them in the first place.
One of the provisions we have, one of the provisions we included in the bill was to limit military-style weapons going to local law enforcement. We have civilian police. These are not military police. And when they use military-style weapons, it just sets up the wrong image of what a community wants to see. So that's one of the areas. A second area that might be unfinished business for the Maryland General Assembly and, of course, for Congress is to look at what law enforcement should be doing and whether we're adequately funding services that should not have to be performed by police officers, such as mental health intervention, drug addiction issues, domestic issues, where I can't tell you how frequently I've talked to police officers who tell me they get to a scene where someone's OD'd, they bring the person back to life, and then the person just walks away because they have really no ability to do much more. and it becomes a challenge in the future. Whereas that person needs help, not by police, they need help by professionals who can deal with the addiction issues. So part of this is to integrate into our public safety programs resources to deal with mental health, to deal with addiction, to deal with family issues. And I guess I'll make a plug to the Maryland General Assembly. You've been in the forefront of so many of these issues. We have provided money under the American Rescue Plan under President Biden for a greater intervention. We've given local governments some additional funds. I think this is one area that would not only help deal with the extra stress that we've seen from COVID-19, but would also deal with some of the problems that we've had historically with police getting involved in community events that they're not really trained to do. Delegate Atterbeary, any thoughts on that?
I agree with you 100%. And when we get back to session in 2022, I'm confident that mental health and police officers' interaction with individuals who have mental health challenges will be in the forefront because officers are not trained to deal with individuals. For instance, I'm right now working with a friend of mine who has a son who is an adult who was charged with trespassing. He has his autism, severe developmental disabilities, and he's being prosecuted. And he can't even comprehend what's going on. He signed paperwork to stay away and the like, and he's violated because he doesn't know. And that's not where our resources should be. I mean, imagine when he runs into the wrong officer who wants to cuff him. He has various tics and things that he does. And he's Black and, tall, but he's a very gentle, kind individual. And so this is a problem. And, we try to explain to him, you could run into the wrong officer while you're hanging out, and this could go very, very bad. And that's reality. And that's the reality that Black parents have to deal with every single day. And so I do think we need to absolutely take a different approach to that. And the General Assembly will be addressing that next session. And we certainly appreciate the funds that you have been able to obtain from us. I want to just touch on the military weapons. We did ban in this legislation the purchase of military or militarized weapons from the surplus programs that were being purchased by different jurisdictions. So we were able to deal with that this past session.
And I appreciate very much your comments during the floor debate, which you underscored that this legislation is not anti-police. It's about equality and fairness, and I couldn't agree with you more. And Mr. Johnson, I appreciate your comments by saying that when you're asking for justice, you're not against police. You're actually for the police. You're for the professionalism of most of our police, overwhelming number of our police who want to do their work properly and fairly. I do want to let you know that we recently confirmed Vanessa Gupta as the number 3 person in the Department of Justice. I mention that because Vanessa Gupta was the one responsible for the crafting of the Baltimore consent decree after Freddie Gray. So we have a high-ranking Justice Department official who's very familiar with Baltimore, very familiar with Maryland. And I do think working with the Maryland General Assembly and Maryland government that we have a partner in the Department of Justice who will want to seize upon what Maryland is doing in order to set a standard. One of the things we're trying to do is to get proper training, but share best practices. And I think Maryland can be an example where best practices can be shared, including what the Maryland General Assembly is doing. So I just bring that to your attention. And Mr. Johnson, just to let you know, your work on behalf of Kristen Clark is paying off. She was they moved it through the committee this morning. So I talked to Senator Schumer about this. I didn't have to talk to him about this. He's very anxious to get the Clark nomination on the floor as our Civil Rights Division head of the Department of Justice. So all of that is moving forward under the Biden administration, which I think will assist us in dealing with these issues. There's a lot more we can talk about in policing. I want to cover one more subject on this, and then I'm just going to broaden it a little bit. When I said we got more to do, including after we pass the justice and policing, we have sentencing issues that are extremely discriminatory in our system. When you look at the demographics of our community and see who is in our prison system, you know there is something wrong. And we took some action in the last Congress to deal with the sentencing issues, and that was a positive step. But we have a long way to go. Now, most of our criminal activities are prosecuted at the state level and not at the federal level. So this requires attention both of our state legislatures and the United States Congress. So as we're looking at additional activities in Maryland and across the nation, I hope we will keep on the radar screen that we still have issues beyond policing that we have to deal with within our justice system and the criminal justice system. Mr. Johnson, your thoughts on that?
I can recall a time growing up in Detroit when Reagan entered office, and I was really young. And he, in lieu of giving tax breaks, he began to cut certain programs. And they emptied out the mental health facilities. And overnight, we began to see, in close proximity to my neighborhood, more homeless people. Only to find out later that when the federal funds for mental health support was cut, hospitals released patients and they would dump them in targeted neighborhoods, and those individuals would wander and they would become homeless. Many of those individuals began to self-medicate with street narcotics. Then you fast forward under the Clinton administration, we began to see more funds for lobbying around private prisons. And it became a business model to lock people up, 3 strikes you out, among other things. And so we created a prison industrial complex very similar to how we built out a military industrial complex in the late 50s and 60s. And it's unfortunate because there are a substantial number of individuals who are in desperate need of mental health support. We have far too many communities and families who are living in trauma and in desperate need of social workers and counseling. But we have decided to criminalize those scenarios. And then you overlay that with the flooding of opioid type drugs that were prescribed illegally in many cases, ushered in by pharmaceuticals like Purdue Pharma. And all of those intersecting points have created criminal justice systems that have not only been inequitable, it is overwhelmed with societal issues that should not be in the criminal justice system. Individuals who have special needs should be treated as such, and this type of wraparound support should be there. Individuals who have mental health issues or concerns, they should be treated as such, and there needs to be more outpatient supportive services. Communities that are in trauma, easily identified. We need the type of social workers and counseling so it's not generational trauma. And we can take the pressure off of the criminal justice system. And unfortunately, communities who are low wealth, African American communities, Latino communities, poor white communities, are the targets. And these are also individuals who lack the type of resources. So if they are caught in the web of the criminal justice system, for far too many of them, it's easier to take pleas for crimes they never committed. Mm-hmm. And even if they take a plea, the sentencing is too harsh. And it's harsh because we have put profit above people to warehouse individuals who actually can be some of the folks we need to produce in society, but yet we've thrown them away.
My guest today on Facebook Live, Derrick Johnson, the president and CEO of the NAACP, and Delegate Vanessa Atterbeary from District 13, Howard County, and vice chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Maryland House of Delegates. In regards to the discrimination in our system, we know about the discrimination in regards to crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Used to be, I think, 1,001 difference in the sentencing guidelines. Crack cocaine, which is used more in communities of color, powder cocaine in white communities, and yet the sentencing is totally discriminatory. Still is to this day, causing great disparity on those that use these drugs based upon race. So these are issues that we've tried to take up at the federal level. Delegate Atterbeary, as Vice Chair of the Judiciary Committee, you have the chance to deal with the criminal code in our state. What is the focus on trying to make sure that we have a system that doesn't discriminate against minority communities?
So I was first elected in 2014, went to Annapolis in 2015, and during that term, we passed the Justice Reinvestment Act, which was a recognition by the General Assembly at the time that we were incarcerating minorities at a much higher rate than their white counterparts for the use of crack cocaine or for the use of marijuana. And so we said, look, folks need rehabilitation, they need treatment beds, and we should be investing in those things instead of simply locking people up for these infractions. So we as a committee, since I've only ever served on the Judiciary Committee, and I'm now my second term, we continue to look at that issue. We also are, I think, next session going to fine tune and take a real serious look at it because Maryland is looking at the legalization of marijuana. So when we're talking about the legalization of marijuana, you have to look at the criminalization of African Americans and people of color being locked up for marijuana use and expunging records and the like for that behavior, which is significantly disproportionate to their white counterparts. And so that is, I know, something we will absolutely be taking up during the next session in the General Assembly.
And as we look at justice and policing, when we look at trying to remove the systemic racism in policing, we have to recognize that we have systemic challenges and racism well beyond just policing. We've already talked about other areas within the criminal justice system. COVID-19 has made it very clear the challenges that we have in our healthcare system. When we take a look at who has been most affected by the virus, by hospitalization, by frontline workers, by lack of access to care, it's been communities of color that have been most impacted by it. I've introduced legislation with Senator Menendez to make our effort to deal with that discriminatory aspect of healthcare and COVID-19. But what my point is this, that when we look at the challenges within communities that make communities more vulnerable, it's not just the way policing is done, it's the communities need attention. So as we look at this, we have to deal with more than just how the police department is acting. We have to look at a broader sense of issues. And I know the NAACP has been extremely active in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking broader, so the example I gave earlier is knowing that the criminal justice issues as we know it goes beyond to good person, bad person, good cop, bad cop. It is a societal opportunity for us to change how we value people, not allow profits to come before people, and create a standard so everyone can truly feel safe and trust law enforcement. You know, you think about the opioid epidemic that is spread across the country. For African Americans, it was the crack epidemic. Unfortunately, we criminalize a mental health concern and never get to the root of how those epidemics spread as aggressively as they did, and what can we be doing to prevent the next spread of chemical dependency? And why are we allowing these type of chemical dependencies to cripple households, neighborhoods, and our nation? We have to go beyond just looking at criminal justice in this narrow way and go much broader so that we can both do good by individual citizens and do well as a society as a whole.
And I want to just compliment President Biden, the Biden-Harris administration, when they used the motto, Build Back Better, because they are talking about building an America that really is fair to all. And when you build back better, yes, it means reform in our policing to make sure all communities are treated equally and fairly, but it goes well beyond that. And President Biden's language, his executive orders, and the legislation he's submitted to Congress have all reflected this desire that all communities be treated fairly, including as we rebuild our health system. The first attack was to deal with COVID-19. And we do know that we had to give special attention to minority communities. The vaccine distribution was not being done fairly. The protection of equipment was not getting into the frontline workers, many of whom, the larger percentage of whom were people of color, that we were not getting the testing done where it needed to be done. All this under the previous administration. The first area of attention by the Biden administration was to make efforts. Now, I want you to know, Delegate Atterbeary, I had conversations with Governor Hogan on this, and I know Maryland is ahead of the national average in reaching minority communities, but we're still not at the same level in minority communities than we are in non-minority communities. We still have to do a better job. And I just welcome your thoughts as to how we can use the resources that have been made available to really carry out our commitment to treat all communities equally.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think first there has to be an acknowledgement by those that have the ability to shape our laws and those that have the ability to implement our laws that systemic racism exists in America. And because systemic racism exists, you have inequalities in education, you have inequalities in healthcare, and you have inequalities in how policing has been done, as we've seen on the national scene. I think, again, it goes back to trust. When we're talking about communities of color or lower income communities, there is a trust there. There's an issue in Baltimore City. There's a trust in the community there with how they've been treated with the hospital there, with Johns Hopkins. And so, folks might not want to receive the vaccine. There's also an issue, if I'm working several different shifts as a single parent to take care of my child, I might not have time to go out and get that second shot or even my first shot. And so we have to create an atmosphere, and we have to create access and trust for individuals who don't have the same resources, as our governor, who wants to tout how well we're doing here in Maryland. I mean, I'm certain he was, probably the first person to get the shot here in the state of Maryland. But we have to make it available to everyone and do everything that we can to achieve that goal.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, I want to go back to the Chauvin conviction for one moment, if I might. Your statements there after the Chauvin conviction was, I thought, right on target, where you point out that, again, this is not anti-police. This is about making it clear that we will not allow those who violate their trust to get away, and that our justice system must recognize the roots in white supremacy and end qualified immunity. Police are here to protect, not lynch. We will not rest until all of our communities have the right to breathe. I think that's something we all agree with. But that was not the end, even in the Chauvin case, because, as you know, recently on May 7th, the Department of Justice announced that it was bringing actions against 4 officers, including Officer Chauvin, for violation of the civil rights statutes. Is that an important action, considering that Mr. Chauvin's been convicted of second-degree murder, which carries, I think, up to 30 years? Tell me the significance of pursuing the indictments for violations of civil rights.
I am glad that DOJ is pursuing this course. So we have to address patterns and practices within agencies that are discriminatory, that in fact do target communities and actually racially profiled individuals. Derrick Chauvin had a long track record of misconduct within that agency. There are several others in that agency. And the only way to hold police officers accountable is to actually get an outside and sometimes independent review of the agency's culture. But I also want to commend the police chief, Arredondo, and the men and women of the Minneapolis police force who actually tore down the blue wall of silence during their case and spoke up clearly and boldly that he was acting outside of any training that they provided, outside of any policies that were in place, and in fact should not have committed murder in broad daylight. But the DOJ stepping in elevates the floor that existed during the Obama administration, but the prior administration took away. But even and them going into Minneapolis and them going into other jurisdictions is almost playing whack-a-mole. We have to create a different standard. And that can only happen through the legislation that you and Senator Booker are working on to make sure that we build trust to keep communities safe. This is truly about trust and safety, and we can do it.
I have been a strong proponent of the hate crime statutes to make it clear that, yes, any criminal activity, the perpetrator needs to be held accountable. But when you commit a crime that's directed and by hate, because a person may look different than you or behave or come from a different ethnic community or be part of the LGBTQ community, any one of these aspects that cause you to act in violence against that individual, that elevates the issue because of the motivation and should be treated as a separate criminal act. And we have passed hate crimes at the national level. The Maryland legislature has also acted in this area. I just really want to go back, if I could, to Delegate Atterbeary as to protecting communities. Right now, in our community, the community that's probably at the greatest danger is the Asian American community as a result of irresponsible conduct by the previous administration in the characterization of the coronavirus. Now, we could go back a while and there was a challenge to the Muslim American community. There still is, don't get me wrong, or the African American community, or the Jewish community, or the LGBT community, or any of the ethnic communities. We have seen overall a rise of hate in America and a rise of hate crimes in America. We've documented significant increases in all these categories. I think we really need to put a spotlight on prosecution of hate crimes so that the public knows we will not tolerate hate and we're united. If any community is not safe, none of us are safe. So I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about how the Maryland General Assembly is looking at protecting all communities during this period where we see not only in Maryland, not only in the United States, but around the world, a rise of nationalism, a rise of communities being vulnerable to hate and violence.
In Maryland, the rise of hate crimes has increased significantly over the past several years. Twice since I have been in office, we have increased the penalties in our hate crime statute. We just tweaked it again, I believe 2 sessions ago, and included language related to noose or a swastika being attached to a property because there was a rash of this happening in the state, in Anne Arundel County, I mean at schools, in Howard County where I live, at schools, in parks. And so this is also an issue when we talk about gun violence and access to guns. And now the Supreme Court is going to be taking a look at New York's law, which we're all going to be watching because we don't want to, we have mass shootings now, a lot of which are based on hate, and we don't, the very last thing that we want to do is to weaken laws and states' abilities of individuals to get guns before we get a handle on this. I couldn't agree more. I think that our local prosecutors should use the local hate crime statute much more than they do. And you just put a little nugget in my head that's interesting. I would like to know in Maryland in the past, 5 years, how many times that statute has actually been used. How many times have individuals actually been prosecuted and convicted for violating the hate crime statute?
I should point out, I thank you for bringing up the gun safety issue. That's one of the areas that we have brought up in our caucus. And we are optimistic that during this year, there will come to the floor of the United States Senate legislation on gun safety. As you know, it's passed the House of Representatives. It died in the graveyard that was created in the last Congress by Leader McConnell not bringing any of these bills to the floor. Senator Schumer, the majority leader, is committed to bringing these bills to the floor. So we hope that we'll be able to pass some common sense gun safety legislation, including universal background checks. We think these are areas that we should be able to move forward, and I think it helps all communities. And it's interesting, on background checks, we have the strong support of the American people, the strong support of Republicans, the strong support of gun owners. So we hope that we'll be able to get some of this done. And I appreciate the Maryland General Assembly and the work that you have done on gun safety, and we certainly appreciate the work of the NAACP on these common sense issues of work in coalition. The last issue I'll bring up, and then I'm afraid we're running out of time, is that, let me just say how pleased Senator Van Hollen and I were to have opportunities to appoint to our federal bench so that we have a more representative judiciary. I think that's all part of a community's confidence that the legal system is really there for all. And Judge Grigsby, when she is confirmed, and she will be confirmed, will be the first woman of color to serve on the United States District Court. So we're very pleased about that. And we're continued to make sure that our opportunities that we have, that we're going to have all aspects of our legal system representative of the communities of our state and nation. So we're going to continue to do that. I'll give you all just any final thoughts in regards to what we can do to deal with the systemic challenges we have in America on racism as it relates to criminal justice system. Why don't I start first with Delegate Atterbeary, and we'll end with Mr. Johnson.
Well, again, I just want to thank you for having me here and being part of this really important conversation. I think we have to continue to elect people that have these issues in the forefront of their minds, and elect people who want to change these issues. Like you said, representation matters. The way I view things in the General Assembly and the way I look at legislation as an African-American woman, as a mother of 3 beautiful little Black children, I understand these issues and I care about these issues, and I bring them forward when we're debating bills, whereas some of my white counterparts might not. And certainly was mentioned on the floor when we were debating policing, when I shared some of my experiences with my father and my brother and my worries about my kids. They said, we don't understand that. We cannot understand that when my children's interactions with their teachers and with the police are at the forefront of my mind every day. So elections matter. I know that you're concerned, Senator Cardin and Mr. Johnson, about elections and what's happening across the country and trying to roll back rights of particularly people of color. And so I think we just have to stay vigilant. And we have to elect the right people to make change. And all of the activists, and we work very closely with the NAACP in this legislation here in Annapolis and a lot of other organizations, we need those folks too. I mean, even though sometimes we might butt heads, we need people. We need people, raising the bullhorn and screaming and yelling. And then we need people like myself and like you, Senator Cardin, who hunker down and look at every single word and every single comma and fight for change within the system. So again, thank you very much for being here.
For
having me.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, again, Senator, thank you for this opportunity. And it was a pleasure to be on this platform with you, Delegate Atterbeary. Elections matter. I absolutely agree. But once the election is over, we also have to carry an agenda. And with criminal justice system is a 360 view. What the past administration did to the federal bench is horrible. I am glad that you are working hard to diversify the court. In NAACP, we take a clear stand that we must do away with the blue slip. It is difficult to diversify the courts in southern states when you have conservative members who refuse to advance nominees who are overly qualified, but they will sit on those appointments. We've seen the blue slip be taken away for circuit court appointments during the last administration. Quite frankly, the blue slip, like the filibuster, are both archaic rules used by segregationists during times in which this nation was looking backwards and not forward. We need to now look forward to make sure we have the type of diversity on the federal bench that mirror the demographics of this country. And in the areas that are seeking most aggressively to take the right away of individuals to cast an effective ballot, citizens who are legally able to vote, it is in those states where they would use the blue slip to block nominees to serve as U.S. attorneys, to serve on district court, on the district court, and several other appointments. So as we look forward to reform criminal justice, we must also look at the federal judiciary and make sure we have the type of representation that mirror our population so that we can have the type of justice that we all aspire to have.
I couldn't agree more, and I also wanted to just promote Judge Boardman, who's our other nominee. She comes with an incredible background as a public defender and brings additional diversity onto our federal bench. So I can assure you, Senator Van Hollen and I will use the opportunities we have, and couldn't agree with you more that we have to really review the filibuster rules in the United States Senate. That's acting as a real impediment to being able to move important legislation forward. So let me thank Derrick Johnson, the President and CEO of the NAACP, for joining me today, and Delegate Vanessa Atterbeary from District 13, Howard County, Vice Chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Maryland House of Delegates. And thank you all for joining us today on Facebook Live as we talked about our criminal justice system and our policing. Everybody stay well, and we'll see you again soon.
Take care.